What's the most thing you have ever done? Story 1. My grandfather retired early due to disability and spent every summer watching me during the day until I was 11 or 12 and could stay home alone after school. He spoiled me endlessly, taking me to amusement parks, toy stores, and all sorts of places. My parents eventually told him to tone it down because I was becoming entitled and acting out when I was around 6 or 7. After that, I once asked my grandfather to take me to the amusement park. He gently explained that my parents had said no, but maybe we could go the following week or the week after. I became incredibly upset. Being manipulative as a child, I started crying. He told me he was sorry, but he didn't want to upset my parents. I looked at him and said, "You just don't love me anymore, do you?" He became really sad and told me that he loved me very much, but we couldn't go. I kept insisting, repeating, "Why don't you love me?" Every time I said it, he grew more distraught until finally he started to cry. I made my 56-year-old grandfather cry, the sweetest man I have ever known. The image of him crying while saying, "Please don't say things like that," is seared into my memory. I think it was one of the most important moments of my childhood for my emotional development. At the time, I couldn't process it immediately. I didn't even apologize. I just went to my room. He never even told my parents what happened. My mom later said that around that time, it seemed like I matured a decade. I became quiet, polite, and well-behaved, and I treated my grandfather with much more respect from that point forward. I couldn't bring myself to apologize until my late teenage years when he was dying of cancer. That's when I found out he wasn't even biologically related to me. He was my mom's stepdad, just one of the best people humanity could offer, and I owe so much of who I am today to him. Story 2. One night a few years ago, my boyfriend, his family, and I ordered Chinese food from our favorite little place. For some reason that night, it didn't sit well with me. About an hour after eating, I got that intense, sick feeling, the kind where you feel like you need to use the bathroom so badly that you might throw up. I went upstairs and took care of it. It's important to note there are 2 bathrooms upstairs and none downstairs, where my boyfriend and I stayed in what felt like a small apartment. After I was sure I was done, I went back down to bed, hoping I could sleep it off. But within 30 seconds of lying down, the urge came back strong. I ran upstairs only to find both bathrooms occupied. His sister refused to get out of the shower despite my emergency, and his dad was using the other toilet, clearly dealing with the same issue I was. I went back downstairs miserable and tried to think of my options as my stomach bubbled worse and worse. Should I break down the bathroom door and risk traumatizing his sister? Drive 30 minutes home? It was far too urgent for either option. I even considered the unthinkable, having an accident and dealing with the humiliation afterward. But I couldn't bring myself to do that in front of my future in-laws. That left me with only one solution: go outside. Their yard was wide open, and the night was bright with moonlight, so there wasn't much cover. The only spot that seemed private enough was under the trampoline. I figured no one had used it in years, and it was out of the way, so no one would accidentally step in anything. So that's what I did. Unfortunately, it was raining lightly, and the trampoline was pouring water on me the whole time. I cleaned up with napkins and wet wipes, went back inside, immediately threw up from the sickness and embarrassment, cleaned that up too, and finally went to bed. Everything was fine for a few days until my boyfriend's dad casually mentioned how he had been late for work one morning. The dog had rolled in something and needed a bath before he could leave. My stomach dropped, but thankfully everyone assumed it was from some animal. Story 3. My hometown is generally middle class to poor. A group of wealthy families lived out in the woods, and one of their kids went to our high school. He bullied the less fortunate kids relentlessly. Years later, he bought a Camaro, removed the muffler, and made it the loudest car in town. On New Year's Eve of 2021, during the tree lighting ceremony while people were caroling and giving thanks, he ruined the tradition by repeatedly driving laps around the town common in that car. By the summer of the following year, my friend and I decided it was time for payback because nobody else wanted to deal with him. My friend's dad owned a junkyard, and they had recently gotten an old train horn from a broken diesel engine. We spent a week setting it up in the back of his work truck and then waited for the right moment. A month later, we heard that the guy was hosting a party for his family and other wealthy friends. We didn't know what the occasion was, but we parked outside his property behind the fence. As the event started, we blasted the train horn and sped off before anyone knew what happened. News spread later, and we found out the gathering we disrupted had been a wake for his late grandfather. Story 4. I am a recovered addict, 9 years sober, and I have many stories that remind me of how reckless I used to be. One of the lowest points was when I was broke and down to my last bag. My usual supplier had just been arrested for driving under the influence, so I started brainstorming ways to get painkillers. Since I still had medical insurance, I decided my best chance was the emergency room. I thought if I could get injured just enough, I might be prescribed something strong. A friend of mine came over, and while we were outside smoking cigarettes, we tried to figure out how I could hurt myself. There was a large cinder block by my garage, and I decided to drop it on my foot, hoping to break a toe. For 5 minutes, I tried to psych myself up, but I couldn't do it. Finally, I told my friend to do it for me, and he agreed. He dropped it from waist height, but it wasn't enough, so I asked him to lift it higher and try again. At the hospital, I told the doctors I had been carrying boxes downstairs, slipped on the bottom step, and dropped them on my foot. They took x-rays, and when the doctor came back, he told me I had torn several ligaments and that it might have been less painful if I had just broken my foot. I was excited, thinking I had succeeded. But when I was released, the only prescription I was given was for ibuprofen, 800 milligrams, total defeat. Story 5. I still remember a moment that haunts me. A child around 6 years old was pulled out of a swimming pool, but I did not step in to help. Where I live, there are laws about victim responsibility. If you intervene to save someone, you become fully responsible for their well-being and treatment, even financially. And the family doesn't have to pay anything. They can even sue you. The law exists to prevent untrained people from causing harm with the wrong treatment. But in hindsight, it feels cruelly ironic. On top of that, I had only received one first aid class years earlier, and I remembered almost nothing. I am clumsy with my strength and often break things accidentally, so the idea of trying chest compressions on a child terrified me. I was afraid I would do more harm than good. Apparently, the other 30 to 50 people standing there felt the same way, or maybe they weren't thinking clearly at all. Everyone just stood around the child, crying and panicking, but doing nothing. Emergency services were called, but they arrived about 20 minutes later. By then, the child had already passed away. I admit this still weighs heavily on me, but writing it out helps me cope. Even now, I'm not sure if I could have helped without making things worse. Story 6. Many years ago, I lived in Japan, where the English school industry was booming. A good friend of mine had spent years developing his own curriculum, and I was his head teacher, helping to create several original educational textbooks for children. He was ready to launch his school, but as a foreigner, incorporating in Japan was nearly impossible without financial backing. He found a local businessman to invest. My friend contributed $50,000, while the businessman contributed $51,000, giving him the controlling share. I never fully understood what happened, but essentially the businessman pulled out at the last minute, stole my friend's $50,000, and there was nothing my friend could do. The businessman then opened the school entirely on his own, using the material I had designed, and cut my friend out completely. Since the businessman didn't know I existed, my friend suggested I respond to his newspaper ad for a head teacher and try to get hired, so we could bring the school down from the inside. I did just that. I was hired as head teacher and put in charge of everything: setting up classrooms, acquiring supplementary books and games, organizing class schedules, and installing all the computers and software. For 3 months, I prepared for the launch, built the curriculum, printed flyers, spoke with parents, and signed up students. 2 days before the school was set to open, I took my revenge. I threw all the computers into the garbage bin, which was collected the next day, and changed all the passwords for the online services. I then tossed out my cell phone and disappeared. Because he was shady, the businessman insisted on paying me in cash, so he never had my bank details or my real address. I had given him a fake one from the start. When I disappeared, he had no way to find me. Later, I heard through the grapevine that this ended up costing him several $100,000. He had to pull money from other businesses to cover the losses, miss the beginning of the school year, and all the parents canceled their contracts. He never managed to win them back. I cost him an entire year and I don't regret it. He stole $50,000 from my friend and exploited young entrepreneurs who were just trying to get started. He got what he deserved, and I now have a backstory as a corporate saboteur. Story 7. When I was a teenager, my grandmother moved in with us as she began to lose her memory. Our relationship quickly deteriorated. Talking on the phone or exchanging letters hadn't prepared me for living with her every day. She changed as her mind slipped away. It wasn't her fault, but I couldn't stand her constant accusations. Everything she misplaced, she swore I had stolen. She couldn't accept that she simply didn't remember where she put things. The worst was when she misplaced some garden photos and demanded my parents search my room, while I shouted that I had never touched them. I was a teenager. Why would I want her garden photos when I could just step outside and see the real thing? One night, I woke up to her shouting my name over and over in that sharp voice I had grown to hate. She was in the bathroom across the hall from my room. I didn't know the time, but I assumed it was early, since she always woke up around 5 in the morning. I figured she was yelling at me again for supposedly stealing something from her private bathroom, which I never entered. So I lay there angry, thinking harsh thoughts, and pretended I couldn't hear her. She kept calling my name for 30 minutes until my mom woke up. I thought, good, now mom can deal with her, and I can sleep. But the truth was devastating. Her kidneys had shut down suddenly. She was vomiting and in serious distress the whole time she called for me, not to accuse me, but because she truly needed help. She was 85 years old. That half hour probably didn't change the outcome, but she died a few days later. I know it wasn't my fault, but her prolonged suffering feels like it was. I never stopped being sorry, Grandma. Story 8. I was at the shore celebrating my 21st birthday, so naturally I had been drinking all day. I went to the boardwalk to ride some attractions, but while waiting in line, I suddenly realized I really needed to use the bathroom. There are several different piers, and I was on the third one, but in my drunken state, I thought I was on the second, where I knew the bathroom was located. I wandered into the closed water park section of the pier, panicking because I couldn't find a bathroom and I couldn't hold it any longer. In my drunken state, I relieved myself directly into the lazy river. I felt guilty, but I also thought no one would see me. Just then, one of the sky trolleys passed overhead. It went directly by where I was standing, and people were looking right at me mid-act. I felt like a character in a movie being watched from above. I quickly finished, ran back to my group, and tried to act casual. Luckily, I wasn't caught, but I do feel bad for anyone who went to the water park the next day. Story 9. About 10 years ago, I was recently divorced and started dating a very attractive but shy woman. We went to a nice restaurant, and she wore a very short dress that could easily be considered daring. A snobby couple at the bar kept staring, laughing, and rolling their eyes at her outfit. She wasn't from the United States, so her sense of style was less conservative than what people in Texas were used to. Their behavior became more and more obnoxious, and I felt awful for her. She had made the effort to wear something bold, only to be ridiculed. The bar stools were tall, and the couple was sitting a little too far from the counter, leaning over their food. As we left, I walked past them, hooked my leg around the man's chair, and pulled it out from under him. He hit his chin on the bar and fell to the ground. A small commotion broke out, and I crouched down as if to check if he was okay. Instead, I just stared at him. I was 6'2" and in good shape at the time. He was not. His wife started yelling, and the manager came over. Since I was a regular, I greeted him by name and said I must have accidentally bumped the chair. Then I walked out, paid the valet, and left with my date. We went home and had a much-needed drink together. Story 10. Before college, my girlfriend gave me her childhood stuffed frog to take with me. When I went home for Christmas break, I discovered she had cheated on me. She was remorseful and wanted to move past it, but I couldn't, so we broke up. After break, I returned to school, saw the stuffed frog on my pillow, thought for a moment, and tore its head off. Years later, my partner and I bought a stuffed bear as a housewarming symbol, and it has become part of the family. I used to make comics about him, and I think stuffed animals hold real importance, not just for children, but into adulthood as well. This past Christmas, my partner received her childhood stuffed puppy, and watching her emotional reaction made me feel guilty. I realized I had destroyed that same kind of sentimental joy for my ex, regardless of what she had done. I know it may sound silly to some, but after 43 years of life, this is honestly the worst thing I can think of doing. I truly regret it. Story 11. At a small backyard party, I secretly took a hallucinogen without telling anyone. After a while, someone asked for a ride to buy cigarettes, and I volunteered, even though I had also been drinking. I convinced myself I felt fine. I drove recklessly down a busy road at nearly 100 miles per hour, then returned through the neighborhood at around 60. On one turn, my car couldn't handle the speed and skidded. It slid along the grassy hill of a corner yard before stopping on the curb, almost like I had parked. The crash made a ton of noise, squealing tires, the bumper ripping off, while my stereo blasted at full volume. My friends later said they could hear me blocks away. The only damage was to the bumper in the hill, but it was my mom's car. I made sure my passenger was okay, then walked back to the party to let everyone know we were fine. After that, I went home, woke my mom, and admitted I had damaged her car. She told me we'd talk in the morning, then went back to sleep. I returned to the party and kept celebrating, thankful that nobody had been hurt. The owner of the yard happened to be out of town. Otherwise, I might have gone to jail. I often count my lucky stars that nothing worse happened. Story 12. When I was a junior in college, I lived in a house with some of my sorority sisters. One of them was dating my boyfriend's roommate, and the four of us were inseparable for about a year and a half. Their relationship, however, was volatile and often dramatic. One night after a party, my friend knocked on my door and told me she had been arrested for assault. She said her boyfriend had been hitting her and strangling her, so she punched him in self-defense and gave him a black eye. Because it happened outside his fraternity house, someone saw them and called the police. Since she had no visible injuries, she was the one arrested. In the months that followed, I supported her completely. I went to every court date, testified as a character witness, and even cut ties with my friends in my boyfriend's fraternity because they sided with him. My now husband and I lost many friendships over this. His fraternity brothers even vandalized our house. I helped her file reports with the college. It consumed my life. The following semester, she got back together with him. I was furious. After everything I had done for her, it felt like a slap in the face. She became angry with me for being upset and eventually admitted she had fabricated the abuse to get him in trouble. Months later, she attacked him again, ripping out his hair, and was arrested, so it seemed clear the violence was actually going in the opposite direction. After everything I endured for her lies, I was devastated. Our sorority sisters took her side and claimed I was being unreasonable. I fell into depression and missed many classes. To make matters worse, she and my housemates began using and selling drugs out of the house. Since I wanted to become a teacher, I was terrified this would ruin my future. I started working on new housing, but it took time. One day when I was home alone, I noticed her iPad, the one she had won at a school fundraiser, sitting out. I don't know what came over me, but I took it and later sold it on eBay for $300. She never found out, and I never told anyone until now. It felt, in a small way, like justice for everything she had put me through. Story 13. My first job after high school, when I was 18, was at UPS. I had a co-worker who was more of an acquaintance than a friend. We never hung out outside of work, but we worked together often. He had a history of prison time, which didn't really bother me, but he had an unnerving way of staring intensely into people's eyes, so I usually avoided eye contact. One day while we were unloading a truck together, I noticed he was wearing a necklace with a small capsule attached. He told me to turn around, and when I looked back, he was sniffing his nose like he had just taken something. He admitted it was a stimulant and, half-joking, offered me some. I told him I wasn't judging, since I didn't control other people's choices. Out of curiosity, I tried a little. At first, I didn't feel much, so I rubbed a bit more along my gums. The effect hit me fast. It was my first experience with a stimulant beyond coffee, and I suddenly felt superhuman. I tore through unloading the truck at incredible speed. It was exhilarating at the time. I don't do those things anymore because I value my brain and my health too much. These days, the most I do is drink occasionally and smoke or vape. But that moment remains a vivid memory of how easily curiosity can lead to unexpected experiences. Story 14. I have been in recovery from intravenous hero addiction for over 14 years. Part of what finally pushed me to clean up my life was a scheme I pulled off in the summer of 2008. At the time, I was 25 or 26 years old, a college graduate who had once lived independently and paid rent and bills as a full-time student. But by then, I was back living with my parents, unable to hold steady employment or function as an independent adult. They knew about my addiction, though I often lied about the extent of it, sometimes claiming I was abstinent or that I was on Suboxone but not using it as prescribed. That summer, I was wearing out my welcome at home and had just been laid off again for failing to meet the basic expectations of a job. My manager had even noted that I spent more time in the bathroom or parking lot than at my desk. With no income, my $100 a day habit was becoming impossible to sustain without stealing or manipulating those closest to me. I often borrowed money I couldn't repay or stole from family. At holiday gatherings, I would sneak cash from relatives' purses or sell my sister's DVDs or raid her change jar from her bartending tips. I knew where my parents kept their cash and regularly took $40 at a time, convincing myself it would go unnoticed. Denial is powerful, especially when parents don't want to face the truth that their child is stealing from them as well as from himself. The worst moment came one Sunday night in August. I was sick, desperate, and had no way to get money. After dinner, I realized my mom had about $140 hidden in her purse, plus another $20 in her cash pocket. My dad had $40 in his wallet. Altogether, $180 was enough for a full day's reprieve. Around that time, a friend called to ask if I wanted to pool money to buy a couple of grams. That was all I needed to set my plan in motion. At first, I only took $60, hoping it might go unnoticed. I snuck out, pushed my car down the street before starting it to avoid waking my parents, and within an hour, I was in a Starbucks bathroom using. I came home around 10:30, my parents still asleep on the couch. Relieved, I went upstairs, logged into World of Warcraft, smoked a cigarette, and settled in. By 1 in the morning, I rationalized using the rest. But by noon the next day, I knew I would be sick again, with my parents asking about the missing money. That's when I hatched a darker plan. I stole everything I could find. My mom's entire wallet, both of their cigarette cartons, even their checkbook. I emptied the medicine cabinet, dumping bottles on the counter to make it look like someone had searched through it. I stashed the money and cigarettes in the basement. Then I unlocked a side door and left the spare key in the lock to make it look like a break-in. Around 4 in the morning, I woke my parents, claiming we had been robbed. My dad stumbled downstairs to inspect while I planted suspicion on an ex-girlfriend, mentioning she knew where the spare key was and had been using again with her new boyfriend. The police came, and one of the officers was an old classmate of mine, which left me feeling both defiant and ashamed. They took a report, asked questions, and left. By 10 that morning, my parents began their day, and I was free to use what I had stolen. By noon, the money was gone, and by the next day, I was broke and sick again. I finally got clean on November 4th, 2008, my sister's birthday. I voted that morning, then went with my dad to detox intake. By then, my parents had thrown me out after finding hundreds of needles, pipes, baggies, and other evidence in my room. I stayed with the same friend who had once pooled money with me, and in a cruel twist, he died of an overdose just 2 months after my staged robbery. I found him when I returned to the apartment, and it shook me to the core. That tragedy, along with my family's pain, finally pushed me to turn my life around. I eventually came clean to my parents while in treatment. They weren't surprised. They told me later that the police wanted to interview me again, but my dad managed to deflect it. If I hadn't gone into treatment and truly committed, he would have had no problem turning me in. I can't imagine the pain of being a parent, watching your only son spiral like that. Since then, I have gone back to school for graduate training in social work and public health, and I've spent over 10 years working as a therapist with people struggling with addiction and homelessness. I've buried friends, cousins, and patients lost to fentanyl, but I've also celebrated countless recoveries. I regret the harm I caused my family deeply, but those experiences allow me to connect with my patients in ways they rarely experience. I believe the opposite of addiction is not simply sobriety, it is human connection. And when people are given those connections and opportunities, we do recover. Story 15. When I was in college, one of my roommates sublet her room for the summer. One day I was doing a huge load of laundry which meant going up and down the stairs of our apartment building constantly. Whenever any of us went out briefly or did laundry, we would usually leave the door unlocked. It was clear I was doing laundry, and the sublet roommate had seen me several times. But during one of my trips back upstairs, I found the door locked. I knocked and rang the bell repeatedly, but there was no answer, and my keys were in my room. To get back in, you had to pay around $50 to $100 for a replacement fob or key just to borrow it temporarily, and if it was actually lost, the cost was much higher. I had no choice but to go to the main office, explain I was locked out, and pay the $100. I got the borrowed fob, let myself back in, retrieved my keys, and returned the fob. I was furious that the sublet had locked me out and cost me what was essentially my food money for the month. Out of spite, I went into her room, found it unlocked, and took the first valuable thing I saw, her iPod. I sold it to make up the money I had lost, with a little extra. She never apologized for locking me out, and she never mentioned the missing iPod. Story 16. For me, survivor's guilt is the heaviest burden. My sister took her own life while she was at university. We knew she was struggling, and the university also knew, but after spring break, my family let her go back. I have a clear memory of the moment when I should have spoken up, when I should have said, "No, she can't go back, not if this is the situation." But I stayed silent. 2 weeks later, she was gone. I don't blame my family, but I know in my heart that if I had raised my voice for even 5 seconds, she would still be alive. I never got to say goodbye, never gave her one last hug or told her how much I cared. One day she left, and then she was gone. My family later took the university to court, arguing that their negligence had caused her psychological harm, and the court found them guilty. That case has since helped create networks and petitions in the United Kingdom, calling for a duty of care for students, which the judge confirmed does not formally exist. I hope the lives that may be saved through this legislation will, in some way, make amends for my sister's loss. Story 17. At my first job, there was a manager who constantly harassed young women. He was a bully too, an exaggerated version of an old-fashioned factory boss. To make matters worse, he was the brother of a wealthy and powerful politician, which made him feel untouchable. I decided to fight back in my own way. I moved his belongings around so he would find them in strange places. I invented a fake project and left just enough information lying around so that he ended up presenting it at an executive meeting, leaving the shareholders completely confused. I tampered with the dates and times on his digital devices, altered entries in his work diary, and generally messed with his sense of reality. In short, I gaslit him into thinking he was losing his mind, knowing that dementia ran in his family. This went on for about 7 months. During that time, he stopped harassing women and lost his edge as a bully because he was too shaken. Eventually, he suffered a breakdown and retired completely. I don't regret it. He was a terrible person, and the world is better off with him confined to his mansion. Still, I know that pushing someone to the brink like that is the darkest thing I have ever done. Story 18. When I was 17 and in basic training for the British Army, we went to Cornwall for some adventure training. That meant rope work, climbing, abseiling, kayaking, mountaineering, stuff like that. One day we were training on some coastal cliffs at an inlet where the sea rushed in below us. The opposite cliff face was about 20 meters away, with jagged rocks and waves 50 meters beneath. 2 ropes were stretched across the gap, one for crossing, the other as a safety line. The exercise was to lie on the rope, hook yourself on with a carabiner, and pull yourself and your kit across. The hardest part was learning to regain, which is when you lose your position and end up dangling underneath, and you have to swing and pull yourself back up onto the rope. It was exhausting, especially with gear. We had been at it for hours when the instructor did something reckless. He crossed the rope, performed a regain, and finished the crossing without using the safety line. If he had fallen, he would have been dead instantly. Looking back, it was pure recklessness. But at the time, we thought it was the kind of wild behavior we admired in our late teens. In the Army then, the real currency outside of cash was the crate, a case of lager. Screw up, you owed a crate. Lose a dare, you owed a crate. Do someone a big favor, you bought a crate. So the instructor finished his stunt, climbed up the far side and shouted, "Crate for anyone who does that." Before he even finished the sentence, I was on the rope, shimmying out over the water. I did my regain, made it across, and climbed up beside him. I expected cheers and congratulations. Instead, he punched me in the chest and gave me a furious lecture, yelling that I had almost put him in prison, but he still bought the crate. When I got back to camp, I realized how unbelievably stupid I had been. The lesson was drilled into me again and again by NCOs and officers, both publicly and privately. Now that I'm 41 looking back, it terrifies me far more than it did at the time. Story 19. About 15 years ago, I was staying with a girlfriend who was always in the mood, which was great for me. One day, I had the day off while she was at work. Around midday, I had to use the bathroom, and it turned into one of those endless sessions where it felt like wiping with a brown marker. No matter how much I wiped, it never seemed to end. To avoid wasting toilet paper, I figured I'd just take a shower. But when I went to grab a towel, I realized there were none clean. I started a load of laundry and decided to wait until it was done before showering. To my surprise, my girlfriend came home early. She didn't say a word, just pushed me onto the couch, pulled down my boxers, and immediately went to work. I clenched as tightly as I could, but after she finished and headed toward the bedroom, I stood up and saw it. A long, unmistakable brown streak down her beige couch cushion. My instincts took over. I quickly flipped the cushion, followed her into the bedroom, and acted like nothing had happened. She never mentioned it, so I assumed she never noticed. To this day, though, I still get flashbacks of that couch, and I cringe every time I remember it. Story 20. When I was about 9 years old, my mom brought out her old BB rifles from when she was a kid, and my brother and I would play with them in the yard. At first, we just shot at glass bottles and other targets, but eventually I started aiming at birds. One day I hit one straight through the heart as it was taking off. I felt proud of my aim, and even my mom seemed impressed. But she didn't like the idea of an animal dying for nothing. She always believed in giving purpose to a life taken, so she suggested feeding the bird to our outdoor cat. The cat wouldn't touch it, though. She only ate live prey. My mom was disappointed but thanked me for trying to give the bird's death meaning, and together we buried it in the backyard. A few days later, I grew bored of target practice and went back to hunting birds. This time, I got 3 and collected them. Remembering my mom's words, I thought I needed to make sure they didn't die for nothing. My 9-year-old logic told me to use their feathers for art. I pinned the birds up on the clothesline to dry so I could collect the feathers later. But after only a day, I got impatient. Bored, I grabbed a can of gold spray paint and covered them. They ended up strung by their feet, shimmering in the sun like strange decorations. The next day they were gone, most likely taken by wild animals that didn't mind the taste of spray paint. Story 21. About 12 years ago, in my mid-30s, I was in São Paulo, Brazil, on a business trip. One Friday night, I decided to go clubbing. I drank heavily, and before long, 2 younger men befriended me. They introduced me to a couple of stunning women who looked like movie stars, and we started dancing. They pressed against me, guided my hands, and kept me distracted. The club was massive, and we were on one of the upper floors. Suddenly, my instincts kicked in. I snapped out of my drunken haze and realized the situation felt dangerous. I quickly slipped through the crowd to the other side of the floor. When I looked back, the 2 men were right behind me, smiling and sticking close. My panic rose. I tried to play it off, kept dancing, maybe even bought another round to keep up appearances. After 20 minutes, I steered us back across the floor, pretending to still be in party mode. Then the moment I spotted a staircase beside me, I bolted. I sprinted down 3 floors, skipped steps, and burst out the door straight into a waiting cab. I told the driver to take off immediately and made it back to my hotel safely. I was, and still am, married with children. That night could have ended in robbery, injury, or worse. Brazil can be dangerous for outsiders, and I was reckless. I was lucky to walk away unscathed, but it remains the scariest close call from my business trips. Story 22. About 15 years ago, I was stranded in a town in Illinois late at night. The area was unsafe, and I had no one nearby to help. My family lived in another state. Desperate, I called a taxi and told them my mom would be paying. I asked to be dropped at a McDonald's. After waiting outside, the driver urged me to get back into the car, but I refused. His boss, angry on the phone, ordered him to take me to my mom's address, which I had mistakenly given when I called. When we got there, my mom came outside. The driver asked who she was, and I lied, saying she was my sister. He snapped, asking, "So what is she going to do?" I replied sarcastically, "Nothing. Ever heard of doing a good deed?" I sent my mom back inside, insisting I would handle it. We sat in the driveway for a while until his boss yelled again, this time telling him to drive me to the police station. At first I agreed, knowing I might face charges for not paying. But then his boss laughed and suggested, "Take her back to Illinois and force her into a mental hospital." "That's funny. That's what we should do to her." The driver agreed and refused to let me out of the car. Terrified, I called the police and reported I was being held against my will. The operator on speakerphone told the driver to pull over since they had my location. He finally did, and after 10 minutes of waiting with no officers showing up, I got out and walked away. He glared at me the whole time. I made my way to a Wendy's, threw away my outer clothes to disguise myself, tied my hair back, and hid in the bathroom. Eventually, I took back roads to my mom's house. I never saw the driver again. Maybe he drove back to Illinois and put me on some blacklist. Or maybe he reported me to the police, but nothing came of it since he was from out of state. Either way, I never faced charges, never got a call, nothing. It was a terrifying night, and though I was scared and made bad choices, I did what I thought was necessary for my safety. I would never do something like that again. Story 23. When I was 11, my mom unexpectedly sent me to live with my dad in Florida. I arrived with 2 suitcases, and while my dad welcomed me, his wife clearly wasn't pleased. I only saw my dad once a year before that, so I clung to him for security, which made his wife act like I was competition. Over time, she became verbally abusive, accusing me of terrible things and twisting situations to make me look bad. If I walked down the road with the only 3 kids who lived nearby, 1 girl and 2 brothers, she would call me names when I got home. My dad worked long hours, so he never knew. When I started my period, I was only allowed to use pads, even though my dad's wife used tampons herself. Before a family trip to the water park, I went to the school nurse for help. She kindly spent her whole lunch break teaching me how to use tampons. And thanks to her, I had a great time at the park without my dad's wife finding out. But soon after, my dad's wife confronted me angrily, accusing me of all sorts of things when she noticed she hadn't needed to buy pads that month. My dad finally stepped in, but the next day while he was at work, she dragged me into the bathroom and cut off my waist-length hair to my earlobes as punishment. My dad was furious, but the damage was done. I wanted revenge. She had a ritual of applying hair removal cream on her legs while washing her hair in the sink. In my 12-year-old mind, I thought it would be poetic justice to swap some of her shampoo with the cream. I emptied half of the bottle and refilled it with her Nair. She didn't leave it in long enough to lose everything, but it caused bald spots and breakage. At the time, I felt like an avenging angel. Looking back as an adult, I feel guilty, but in that moment, it felt like justice for what she had done to me. Story 24. When I was about 10 or 12, I visited family in Central America who kept farm animals. I spent my time wandering around, bothering the chickens by trying to pick up their chicks. The hens hated it, but I kept doing it anyway. One day I tried to grab a chick and the mother hen attacked, flapping and kicking at me. I understood she wanted me to stop, but in the chaos she accidentally trampled one of her own babies. The chick was in awful shape. Its eye was bulging, its body bruised, and it let out weak, pitiful noises. I instantly realized it was my fault. The poor thing wasn't going to survive, and I knew someone needed to put it out of its misery. But I couldn't bring myself to do it. I picked it up and tried to find someone to help. In panic and guilt, I ran into the kitchen with the dying chick in my hands, stumbling through an explanation in broken Spanish while fighting back tears. My family laughed at the sight of me, but I was horrified and ashamed. That day stuck with me, not only because of the chick, but because I knew my stubbornness and carelessness had caused its suffering. Story 25. I've told this story before, but it never loses its meaning for me. It was the last time I made my dad laugh, the last story I ever told him. Remembering it makes me both sad and grateful because it was such a ridiculous story, but it brought him joy in one of his hardest moments. Back in February 2014, my dad was having heart problems and had to go in for some tests. We all feared the news wouldn't be good, so I arranged to be there early in the morning. The night before, we washed a big down comforter that broke apart in the machine, leaving feathers everywhere. Then we did a load of clothes right after, so feathers and everything. The next morning, running late, I got dressed in clothes from the dryer, shook them out as best I could, and headed out, stopping at McDonald's for 2 Egg McMuffins on the way. By the time I got to the hospital, my stomach was in turmoil, and I realized feathers were still in my clothes. Each step toward the building was torture. I had to find a bathroom immediately. The first one I found was out of order, but a nurse pointed me to a single-stall accessible restroom. I rushed in, locked the door, and barely got my pants down before disaster struck. Feathers spilled from my underwear as a torrent of sickness hit the toilet and floor. I was hovering, trying not to get it on myself, while more feathers floated down. By the end, the mess looked unreal, like someone had put a goose in a blender with toilet paper. Standing there, I thought, if I walked in on this, I'd wonder forever what on earth had happened. And so I made a choice. I left it. Didn't flush, didn't clean, just left that strange crime scene for the next unlucky person to puzzle over. That night, I told my dad the story. He was down, knowing he faced triple bypass surgery soon, but as I told it, he laughed harder than I'd heard in ages. 2 days later, on my birthday, he died suddenly of a heart attack in his driveway. That moment, that laugh, was the last gift I got from him. Story 26. Years ago, I moved to another city because of a girl I had fallen deeply for. What started as love turned into an obsession. It clouded my judgment and made me act in ways that frightened her, to the point where she had to cut me off completely. Looking back, I understand. It was the best thing for her and for me. I never laid a hand on her, and I never would have. But my instability and intensity made it hard for her to feel safe. From the outside, I know it must have looked dangerous. I can now admit that even though I never intended to hurt her emotionally, my behavior did exactly that. I've carried guilt and shame for it ever since. I wish I could speak to her now, not to undo the past, but to acknowledge how much she once meant to me and how much I regret my actions. But I know she won't and shouldn't let me back into her life. I've respected that and stayed away. Instead, I've turned inward, analyzing my behavior, trying to understand what drove me to such extremes, and working hard to change those patterns so I never repeat them with anyone else. It hasn't been easy, but it's been necessary. I believe the suffering I've felt since then is my karma, my consequence for how I made her feel. She was patient, far more patient than I deserved. I can't ask for forgiveness, but I do want to say I'm sorry for everything. If she ever came across these words, I'd want her to know that I forgive the moments she wasn't perfect with me, even though they don't compare to how unsafe and stressed I made her feel. She was a saint to put up with me as long as she did. And while I couldn't change while she was still in my life, I'm committed to being better now. Story 27. When I was 7, I became close friends with a girl named Mary. We were neighbors, so we often went back and forth between each other's houses to play. Her father was a raging alcoholic, and on many occasions I heard him screaming at both Mary and her mother. I never personally saw him hit them, but Mary often came to school with bruises on her arms. As we grew older, things got worse. Eventually, Mary's mom took her own life. I won't go into the details because her death deserves respect, not drama. After that, Mary didn't want to live with her dad anymore, but she had no choice. She was still underage and he was her only living relative. Despite the fact that everyone in our small town knew what kind of man he was, no one did anything to protect her. So I decided to act. At home, I found a few inappropriate childhood photos my parents had taken of me and my siblings. They were odd like that. The next time I was at Mary's house, I hid those photos in her dad's drawer. Then I called the police and told them that her father had been abusing me for years and that he had threatened to hurt Mary and her mom if I spoke out. Between my statement, the photos, and his already terrible reputation, the authorities had enough to put him away. He was sentenced to 20 years. He didn't even last one. He was beaten badly in prison and eventually took his own life. Mary went into foster care for 5 months before an elderly couple in our community adopted her. She finally had the safe home she deserved. She and I remained close friends until she moved to Seattle last spring. I don't regret what I did. Story 28. When my wife and I were still dating, about 6 months in, I joined her family for a week-long cabin vacation by the river. There were 10 of us in total, her parents, siblings, their partners, and me. I didn't know them very well yet, and I was trying to make a good impression. One night we partied hard, and I drank way too much. After stumbling into bed, I tried to sleep it off, but within 20 minutes my stomach was rebelling. I jumped up to get to the bathroom, but before I reached the toilet or sink, I vomited in the hallway. Only a little mess landed there, but when I made it to the bathroom, I projectile vomited all over the vanity, right where everyone's toothbrushes were neatly lined up. In that moment of drunken panic, I realized we were nearly an hour away from the nearest store, and there was no way I could explain what had just happened to the family. So, in my blackout state, I went into cleanup mode. I spent over an hour scrubbing 8 vomit-covered toothbrushes with Dawn dish soap, rinsing and rinsing, trying to make sure no trace of what happened remained. I also cleaned up the floor and vanity until there was no visible evidence. The next morning, no one suspected a thing. To this day, I've never told anyone in her family what happened. It's a secret I'll probably take to the grave. Story 29. There's something I've hated myself for a long time. After breaking up with my long-term girlfriend, I felt depressed and didn't want to be alone, so I reached out to my best friend. He had a Christmas party at work but told me I could hang out with his wife, who was newly pregnant, until he got back. I agreed since we'd all spent time together many times before. That night, while talking, she confided that she was unhappy in her marriage and admitted she had been chatting with other men, fantasizing about an affair. When my friend came home drunk and went straight to bed, I thought the night was over. But when I was lying in bed on my phone, she texted me to say she was glad I had listened to her and that it was a pity our conversation had ended. A few minutes later, she came into my room. After some more talking, she suddenly leapt on me and initiated something physical. I was frozen in shock, too stunned to stop it. Afterwards, we talked briefly and went to bed. The next morning was painfully awkward. Later, she began messaging me about how crazy the night had been and said she wanted to run away with me. When I told her I didn't want that, she accused me of using her. That was the end of it. We stopped talking, but in that one night, I lost years of trust and destroyed my friendship. It still eats at me that I let it happen. Story 30. Back in high school, I was the awkward, shy nerd, constantly bullied by the cool kids. One of those kids was a wealthy rugby player with a prized old-school blue Volkswagen Beetle with a flashy chrome engine. Somehow, we ended up hooking up in secret for a while, but in public, he pretended not to know me and kept up the casual bullying with his friends. Months later, after I stopped seeing him, another rugby teammate, one who was genuinely kind, started showing interest in me. He wanted to ask me to prom, but when the original guy heard about it, he suddenly called dibs and acted like he had a crush on me, only after someone else showed interest. It wasn't about liking me. It was about blocking someone else from being with me. The nice guy backed off because of bros before hoes. I was furious. I didn't know how to stand up for myself, so I turned my anger into a passive-aggressive act of revenge. I poured a bag of sugar into the gas tank of that rugby player's beloved Beetle. Later, I overheard him complaining in the hallway to his friends about how his car was giving him endless problems. He said he'd had the engine flushed twice, and the mechanic still couldn't figure out what was wrong. At the time, I felt a twisted sense of satisfaction. Now looking back, I see it was an insecure teenager's way of fighting back when she didn't know how to defend herself in healthier ways. Story 31. When I was 15 or 16, I got blackout drunk with some friends. Around 3 in the morning, we saw a man walking down the street. He went into a gas station and came out with a bottle of vodka and cigarettes. My friends convinced me we should rob him. They handed me a gun and I hid in the bushes. When he came out, I pointed the gun at him and took everything he had. One of my friends panicked and said, "If we just leave, he's going to call the cops." So instead of running, we beat him until he was unconscious. Then we took off. Thankfully, someone came by soon after and called the police, because the man ended up in a coma for 2 weeks. If he hadn't been found, he probably would have died. We weren't hard to catch. A few miles away, the police arrested us while we were drinking the vodka we had stolen. I spent a few months in jail and was put on probation. That was the wake-up call. I realized I was running with the wrong crowd and destroying myself in the process. I've turned my life around since then, but the guilt still eats at me. It's one of those memories that never really leaves, a reminder of just how low I sank. Story 32. For a while, I worked as a caregiver for higher functioning individuals with disabilities. Most of my clients were great, but there was one girl who targeted me relentlessly. It was documented and even admitted by her that she singled me out. She would eat my food, steal from my car, accuse me of abuse, and lie constantly. One day I had baked cookies during a 16-hour shift at her house. I ate two, then set the rest aside to enjoy later. She watched me make them, and I even offered to share. But when I came back, the entire bag was gone. She had eaten every last one. I was furious. When she left the house, I went into her room and took the cost of the cookies out of her money. I figured the company wouldn't reimburse me since she never faced any consequences for her behavior. What I didn't know was that the money she had was supposed to be used to pay back the company for something else she had stolen. Because I took it, she ended up having to cover that debt herself with her personal money. Looking back, I know it was unethical, but at the time, she had made my life hell for as long as I worked there. I don't regret standing up for myself in that small, petty way, even if it wasn't the right thing to do. Story 33. I grew up near a kid whose parents were in and out of prison and on drugs, so he was raised mostly by his wealthy grandparents. Over time, the kid drifted away, but I stayed close with his grandparents. His grandmother was a real estate investor and often traveled, while his grandfather, a retired neurologist, stayed home. In 2015, when I was 18, the grandmother called me. She hadn't heard from her husband in days and asked me to check on him. I went to the house, stayed on the phone with her, and eventually found an open window to climb through. I searched until I found him, dead, completely naked, sitting in a chair, with blood and waste pooled beneath him. I had to tell his wife, over the phone, that her husband was gone while standing right there in the room with him. At the time, I was strung out on Xanax, Hero, and anything else I could get. The sight shook me to my core, and my way of coping was to get even higher. After the police came and took the body, I blacked out on 3 Xanax bars. In that blackout, I went back to the house and stole from it. Guns, electronics, cash. I sold everything for drug money. When the grandmother returned, devastated and mourning, she called me crying and asked me to help her. I had to watch her process her husband's death while knowing I had robbed her in her darkest moment. I added insult to unbearable injury. Now, years later, clean and 4 years off Hero, it feels surreal, almost like it didn't happen. But it did. I wish I could undo it. I've changed my life since then, but that memory is something I'll never escape. Story 34. The worst thing I ever did was take my brother's mistress, who also happened to be my best friend, to his 20th wedding anniversary party. She and I had been inseparable since grade school, stayed close through high school and college, and I trusted her completely. She knew my brother too, and she knew exactly what kind of man he was. A liar, a cheater, a smooth-talking charmer. The kind of guy we always swore she would never fall for. But somehow, she did. I didn't know when their affair began, because they both kept it from me. I only found out when she suddenly started showing an unusual interest in my niece, my brother's daughter. When I questioned her about it, she finally confessed. She said my brother and his wife were separated on the brink of divorce, and that he planned to marry her as soon as the paperwork went through. She even claimed he had his own place and wasn't living with his wife anymore. I told her he was lying, but she accused me of trying to ruin their relationship. She insisted he had warned her I'd say that. We argued and then stopped talking for weeks. Finally, I realized she would never believe me until she saw the truth with her own eyes. So I called to apologize and invited her to a family party. When she arrived and realized it was my brother's anniversary celebration, with him acting lovey-dovey with his wife in front of everyone, her face said it all. She was stunned and furious with me. She was angry that I had tricked her, but in that moment, she finally understood he had been lying to her all along. It was cruel and it ended our friendship for a while, but it was the only way I could make her see the truth. Story 35. In my mid-20s, I was homeless in New York City. I didn't look homeless, but I was strung out and spent most nights drifting near a fancy hotel off Fifth Avenue. People looking for drugs often approached me. One summer night, a French man with a heavy accent asked me to get him something. He offered good money and even had a driver. All I had to do was ride along, pick up what he wanted, and get dropped back off. Easy enough. When we returned, he invited me to his hotel suite, saying he was with two women who also wanted to get high. I agreed. It was better than sleeping on the street. Upstairs, I found two French women who didn't speak English, anxious and desperate. I handed over what I'd picked up, kept my cut, and crashed on the couch. They offered me Xanax. To my shock, they pulled out what looked like a medical-grade bag with thousands of pills. I took one or two and tried to relax. After a while, they began arguing in the back. I couldn't understand, but eventually it went quiet. Soon they were all nodded out. Temptation got the better of me. I stuffed my cargo shorts with Xanax, rifled through their purses and wallets, and walked out with thousands of dollars. On the train downtown, I told myself I wouldn't touch the pills. I'd sell them, keep the money, and straighten out my life. That was the last clear thought I had. The next several days are a blur. Friends later told me stories of things I had done in that blackout. Fighting strangers, wandering aimlessly, even falling onto the subway tracks. I have flashes of memory, like being pulled up from the rails by some stranger, or sitting in a park with crushed Xanax scattered around me. At one point, I woke with money in my hand, only to close my eyes and reopen them to find the money gone and other junkies scooping up my pills. Eventually, the police found me and arrested me. I was beaten up, ribs broken from my subway fall, and in full withdrawal. They took me to Rikers Island. My bail was set at $1, just one, but I didn't even have that. Another inmate gave me $1, and I walked free. That night, I went back to my usual spot. Not even an hour later, the same Frenchman showed up again, asking me to score for him. But this time, he made it clear I wasn't allowed back up to the hotel room. I laughed, did the run, and when I came back, I didn't bother trying to sleep indoors. I curled up on the street instead. Story 36. Back in the 1980s, I left home on my 18th birthday without telling my abusive parents where I was going. I had already graduated high school and was set to join the military. I'd been working with a recruiter since the start of senior year, Staff Sergeant P, who honestly felt more like a parent to me than my own ever had. He helped me keep myself together until I could get out. I served my time in the military, got out, and eventually went to college at a university not too far from the small town I grew up in. I never once went back to that town. While at school, I met a girl a couple years younger than me, from a town not far from mine. We clicked right away, shared a lot of interests, and after a few months started dating. Once her lease was up, she moved in with me. She didn't talk much about her family. All she ever said was that her mom had passed during her first year of college, her dad was never around, and her parents fought a lot. I didn't press, she didn't want to talk about her family, and I didn't want to talk about mine either. For about 3 years, we had a great relationship. We even talked about marriage, but in the end, we went our separate ways. Fast forward 25 years. I'm married with 2 kids in high school, living on the East Coast. My wife is amazing, and I've done my best to be the kind of parent my kids deserve, the opposite of what I grew up with. In 2017, I decided to do one of those DNA tests, mostly because I had no family medical history to go on. Both of my parents had already passed, so I couldn't ask them even if I wanted to. When the results came back, I learned I had a sister, 2 years younger than me, same father. I looked at her profile and my heart dropped. It was her, my college girlfriend, the girl I almost married. Eventually, I reached out and we spoke on the phone. She was living on the West Coast, married, with 3 kids. She sounded happy. We agreed to keep in touch, but also agreed never to speak about the years when we had been together. Story 37. About 5 years ago, when I was a teenager working in fast food, my manager frustrated me more than usual one shift. They were being unfair and making my job miserable. During my break, I called a coworker who was off that day, venting about how awful the manager was. My coworker offered to send one of their friends to have a go at the manager. I hesitated, but I was angry and eventually agreed. 10 minutes later, a man walked in. He pretended to be a customer and absolutely unloaded on my manager. He ripped into them for how they supposedly treated employees, calling them a disgusting human being and dragging their character for a good 6 or 7 minutes. My manager stood there in tears and I sat frozen, realizing I had let this happen. At first, I thought they deserved it, but the guilt set in fast. I saw my manager later on the phone with their mom, crying their eyes out, and I felt like the lowest person alive. I could have stopped it. I should have.